So yes, in the CGIAR we have gone through quite a long journey on an evolution towards an impact culture, but I'll speak with you this morning both about what we would call an outcome culture and an impact culture, and I hope that by the end of this you'll understand what I mean by that. First though, impact assessment has played a big role in the CGIAR for a long time. You may have heard of these pretty impressive impact studies that the CGIAR has benefited from a lot. And clearly, the fact that crop genetic improvement is clearly a classic public good. It's relatively easy to research, and it has been shown time and again that you can demonstrate big spillovers, big impacts at scale through crop genetic improvement. And estimates of the CG's contribution to crop genetic improvement have shown to be extremely large. In fact, a number of those impact studies have come back with rates of returns that are just amazing. Now, there are people that are questioning those studies and say, well, are those really true? But they have certainly been extremely helpful to maintain high levels of investment from donors. World Bank economists have come back on a number of occasions and have said investments in agricultural research for development are the best development investment bar none. I mean, very high praise for our area of work. But while we had economists doing that, sometimes economists outside the CGIAR, those were relatively isolated pockets of interest. I don't think we could say that there was an impact culture in the CGIAR. In fact, conclusions over the last 10-15 years are that for decades the CGIAR has underinvested in impact assessment. And in fact, there are relatively large parts of our agenda that we would now today say are under-evaluated. And we struggle with that as well. Areas like livestock, natural resources management, or water, that I have my own background in, are under-evaluated. There are very few impact assessments, and we struggle to justify future investments with our donors. So all that led in the late 1990s already to the establishment of a group that's called our Standing Panel on Impact Assessment. So that's a little group sitting in Rome, not quite in the middle of our centers, but part of our science council, whose task is to try and help stimulate this impact culture. They've done, if you like, impact assessments themselves, but particularly since 2009, they've worked on a major project to try and come up with a baseline on, in essence, adoption and dissemination of modern varieties. So saying, can we go out, not just doing the normal little pilots or normal little case studies, can we go out in a really broad scale and look at a large number of different crops in a large number of countries where we are working and see, what varieties people are using and how many of those are the result of our work. That led to a major effort looking at some 3,500 released cultivars, and in the end the results are that we can show, if you like, adoption of modern varieties. And I find this quite an interesting graph. You see that there are crops that people have worked on for a long time, starting with bananas there at the top, a crop that we show in Agropolis quite a bit as well, where there is very low adoption rates of improvement varieties, all the way to soybeans, where there are extremely high adoption rates of approved varieties. Now, what do we do with that? How can we increase those adoption rates is, of course, the interesting question. The next stage following this so-called DIVA study that is ongoing right now is one where indeed the title of the project is very close to, if you like, the impact culture title of this seminar as well. The idea is that we should strengthen impact assessment throughout the CGIAR, not just as little cells of economists sitting to the side, but indeed getting more and more researchers to not just think of ex post impact assessment once a project is done, but to think about impact assessment right from the start. Not only to just do research and then later conclude it was good work, but to think in advance, how can we in fact increase those dissemination and adoption rates that we've shown in the previous graph are hugely varying. And for that it does a number of different things. Expanding this DIVA approach to Asia as well, trying to make all that work a lot cheaper. There are now modern DNA fingerprinting varieties that make it much cheaper to find out quickly in the field what the parentage of the material that farmers use is, so we can do this much more routinely and much more widespread. Likewise, experimenting with the use of remote sensing and cell phones to not only look at modern varieties, but also at well, methods of natural resources management or water management to similarly document adoption rates over large scales and over a large number of countries. And working with the World Bank Living Standards Measurement Team to identify adoption of technologies we've developed also in the large kind of surveys that others implement. Of course, in the end, I mean, there's quite a few organizations that do regular household surveys, and if they were able to identify adoption of the kind of technologies we've developed, then this would become even more widespread effort to identify impact. That also leads to quite a bit more interest in randomized controlled trials. I've been in a number of discussions where, if I can summarize it, sort of the French approach to impact assessment is more qualitative, telling the story, and the more US style way of doing impact assessment is more quantitative. I must say I've, for the last 10 years or so, worked quite a bit with economists, from the Poverty Action Lab, for instance, people like Esther Duflo, who've said, look, we can actually use what has been the gold standard for impact assessment in the health world much more widely. It is possible to use some of those methods in water and in agriculture and so on. But of course it changes the way we do business, because you can't just send an economist after the project is done. You have to think about research design in advance. You have to think about how do you actually do your research in such a way that you can measure that impact in a really reliable way. And it changes the way you think about impact assessment from not only thinking about documenting impact, but we called a lot of the kind of investments that I helped make when I was at the Gates Foundation, randomized controlled trials on what works. So we deliberately designed randomized controlled trials to find out whether research hypotheses were effective. That's, quite a different way of thinking about the use of impact assessment. Before you can always argue whether it's water and sanitation or it's health that actually has a bigger impact, or whether it's both. But why not do some randomized controlled trial to try and find out in the field what really has an impact on the outcomes that we'd like to see. So that, in a way, changes, for me at least. I worked in water for a long time, and when I worked at IMI in Sri Lanka from 2000 to 2007, indeed, we did very little deliberate impact assessment to figure out what worked. Sure, we did impact assessment because we had to demonstrate to the donors that our work was valuable, but it wasn't really built into our thinking on designing our research agenda. So that, I think, is a big change in this business of changing the culture of impact, not just for resource mobilization, but for our researchers. So yes, we will get online databases, and we will also have something more like a system of quality ratings for impact assessments, because if you look at the past impact assessments, many of the kind of case studies, the pilots that were called impact assessments, aren't really standing up as having real, value of evidence that we would, recognize today. So only a small set of the impact studies that we have actually carried out, we would recognize today as having real value of producing evidence. And finally, there's quite a bit of best practice for, in a way, stimulating more and more of our institutes to adopt these, adoption and dissemination studies more widely. Changing then a bit to what I would like to call an outcome culture. And I have to say, working next door in the building of the CGIAR, a large part of what we try to do within the consortium is get our researchers, not just the economists who do the impact studies, but all of them, to think a bit differently about outcomes. And what I heard Patrick say before is that that was very much what is true for Cirad, was true for the CGIAR as well. Our research planning and management and evaluation was really dominated until quite recently, not by impact, but by science excellence or research excellence. When we would get evaluation of an institute, they would primarily look at the quality of publications. How many publications per scientist? Are they high impact journals that you publish in? They weren't particularly interested in impact or outcomes. So that is a new consensus in the CGIAR for only, I think less than the last 10 years, that our primary accountability as researchers is for outcomes. That our money isn't coming from the National Science Foundation, but it is coming from development ministries, and that what they are doing, and some of our investors say it very simply, they say what we are interested in is to buy outcomes at the lowest possible price. Sure, we're still interested in research quality, but more as quality control over the work we do. It's not the primary product we deliver, it is to show that we are doing good work, that we still of course want to have peer-reviewed publications in high-impact journals. But the most important thing that our research managers, at least now, are asked to do is to have a robust theory of change, to understand not just how you produce new knowledge, but how that leads to a change in outcomes. What the impact pathways are, and I can tell you this leads to endless discussions with our researchers, because you discuss this, and the first thing everybody says, look, I'm a researcher, I'm not responsible for outcomes. And we agree. However, we say at least what you are responsible for is to understand how the knowledge you produce can move to impact, what the impact pathways are, and to understand who the other parties are that are responsible for making that knowledge move into use. And yes, we do hold our researchers responsible for creating those partnerships, not to just produce knowledge into an impact pathway that is empty, or not to just produce knowledge, you know that there are no partnerships that can take it further. So yes, we agree that researchers can't be by themselves held responsible for achieving outcomes. But therefore we say our researchers and our partners jointly can be held responsible for achieving outcomes. And we can certainly be held responsible for understanding these impact pathways and creating those partnerships. And then it's a matter of negotiation. So what outcomes can we be held responsible for? They have this idea, you go from your activities to your results, to your immediate outcomes, to intermediate outcomes, to impacts. And of course, this is, the outcomes are proxies for impact. Our investors want impact. We can't measure, how many lives we saved yesterday. So we have to negotiate what is the kind of outcome that you as researchers feel is close enough to your work that you can be held accountable for, and that investors accept as being close enough to the impact that they're interested in, that there is a relationship. And sometimes that can be very difficult. But in the end, this is, in a way, I'd like to say, negotiating what your shared vision of success is. So what is the vision of success? Why are we investing in research? What result are you really working for? And how can we then come up with mutually agreed proxies for impact that we then use as a way to monitor, measure, not just to hold people responsible for how much money they will get, but also to change their hypothesis for research. If things don't work, we have to not just get more money in the next round, but it will somehow have to feed back into an improved hypothesis for research and a changed research agenda. So this outcome culture is rather a big deal, and it is not so easy to change. For the CG, it has started with having a different strategy. Our first strategy was entirely qualitative, and it had a very good narrative on how we saw the outside world and what the role of research was, but it didn't have any clear, measurable yardsticks. What are you going to deliver, and how can we see how far you get there? We had many research proposals of 350 pages, with lots of outcomes and results and so on, and a big budget separately. And then when about half the money was spent, my board asked me, okay, so how much of what they promised have they delivered? And we had to say, rather embarrassed, that we didn't really agree on measures of progress in the 350 pages of research proposals linked to the outcomes in terms of financial results. So actually linking what we promised to produce to how much it cost is a simple idea and remarkably difficult to implement. It is in fact taking years of getting researchers to think about what it costs and getting our finance managers to think not just in accounting units, but in terms of research outcomes, that we can hope to have in our next strategy something which is more closely linked to outcomes. And yes, certainly our investors want to see a direct link to the Sustainable Development Goals. Very hard. So in New York in September, the world will hopefully agree a new set of development goals. And to say it very simply, we think that over the next 15 years, we will get our investments if we can show that we're making a clear contribution to those SDGs. Now, 15 years ago, when the Millennium Development Goals were just invented, when I would speak with groups of researchers, people were all laughing about the Millennium Development Goals, how simplistic they were, how they were unrealistic, how they were not scientifically valid, and so on. But I think we've all come to the conclusion over the last 15 years that those Millennium Development Goals were extremely influential. They helped steer funding towards different areas of endeavor. They helped create a culture of monitoring what's actually going on, much more looking in the real world what the changes are. And in fact, figuring out what the real ways of measuring some of those things are for which we had these political aspirational goals. So I'm hoping that the SDGs will be that and one level more refined. We don't quite know, but we've certainly tried very hard in our new strategy to come up with things that are linked to the SDGs. So we still have some overall goals that look quite familiar to you probably. We are working on reducing poverty. We've actually changed our food security objective quite a bit. It's not just food security as we had it per se, which is directly linked to productivity increases in calories, but it's an improved food and nutrition security for health measure, which we think actually is quite different than what we had before. And of course we have still a natural resources management ecosystem services goal. And these three things have actually, you probably can't read it, and I won't go into detail, but there's some 8 goals there that are our overall sort of aspirational quantitative goals. So we're really saying to our researchers, okay, so it's those 3 main areas of endeavors that we're going for, and these 8 bullets that you see right underneath those are the big goals that over the next 15 years the CGIAR is trying to achieve. What can you do to help make that a reality? And show us in your proposal. So then I'm showing you how our researchers are saying, okay, so what is our theory of change? In GRISP, I've picked this up because there's actually a lot of French researchers participating in our RISE research program from Cirad and IRD. They have a theory of change that starts at the bottom with having products, but it does go all the way up to that food security, poverty, and sustainability set of goals that I showed you in the previous graph. And there is an idea of how you indeed move from your product through different scales and what it would take to get there. So there is an idea, and Patrick mentioned this, that we have to find ways that are credible that go from the small scale to that larger set of scales. And in fact, I have one other way to sort of represent more or less the same thing. That you go from discovery research, where a lot of this work starts, all the way to scaling up and out, in a way that indeed sort of goes from having primarily a focus on research and science partnerships, to more development type of partnerships. Now we also know that what is one of the specific problems in our work is that this pipeline, this time from discovery research to scaling up and out, is typically way longer than the funding cycles. So it may take 10 to 20 years to go from one side to the other. And if you're getting 3 or maybe maximum 6 years of funding commitment, you can't do all of this through here. So this is an endless discussion we have as well. You know, it takes too much time, you don't give us 20 years commitment. So the thinking is about healthy pipelines in a way. So it's fine that if in a certain 5-year period, what you are scaling up and out is the research that you were working on 10 years ago, and at the same time you are working on discovery research, which will only be scaled up and out 10 or 15 years from now. So in addition to saying, so what are the impacts that we have during this 5-year period, and what are the new products or new discoveries that we're focusing on, we have to add some sort of a measure of the health of the pipeline. We can't either exploit the pipeline by just scaling up and out but not having anything new in the next 10 years, nor can we just focus on discovery research, you know, maybe creating long-term things but not showing any near-term impact at scale. So yes, it's complicated, but that's why we have lots of people thinking about this and a lot of time to get it right. So my final slide, conclusions. Surprisingly, while impact assessment has always played a critical role in resource mobilization for the CGIAR, research planning, management and evaluation tended to really focus on research excellence. Quite divorced things, as if they were not linked. So I think a major part of this culture of impact is to bring those things together. We've also underinvested for a long time in dissemination and adoption studies, and particularly for some underevaluated areas, and that is going to plague us for a long time. I can already see that in the next downturn, in the next round of budget cuts, you know, the cycle of going up and down, when we are going down in our budgets, people are going to come back to those areas that are underevaluated and say, hey, what is the evidence that is actually, you know, really good here? And our scientists are going to say, oh, we're convinced it has impact. But where's your evidence? So this is going to come and bite us in the tail, if you like. So recent efforts are to try and put much more of a solid baseline in place, including what should be open access databases on dissemination and adoption that you know, people here in the room should be able to use as well. And I do think that there should be an opportunity to, in a way, share and collaborate on our results, to have these big baselines that we can all work on, produced internationally. And finally, we are shifting, even though it's slow work, our culture of research, our outcome culture, to one where research planning and management and evaluation is focused much more on development outcomes. Still on science excellence, we will still look at our publications, but they will go hand in hand, if you like, with a real focus on outcomes. And not just to attract more resources. So we do think that our outcome orientation will actually change our research agenda itself, and that it will increase the partnerships that we have to enhance integrated delivery at scale. You know, it is very closely linked, in my mind, we haven't discussed that here that much, but to demand for research. So research doesn't just start with a wonderful hypothesis from a researcher, it goes much more to the outcomes our clients want, and, you know, help translate what it is that our clients in Africa actually have in their national investment strategies, and link it back to what we do. That's a whole separate talk, I think. And finally, of course, still, yes, we also think that it will increase our ability to demonstrate value for money for investors, which is absolutely critical in the world we live in today. Now, I don't have the illusion that any of these are simple things that you can just flip a switch on. And in my role, I often have to explain to people why this is all doable, and then I'm facing large rooms of people like these where everybody says, no, it's not possible. So, you know, we have a very active debate inside the CGIAR as well, in how easy or how hard it is to make this happen. But I can tell you that our external environment, when we go meet with the African Union Commission